Hello Internet, I'm Jackie Fox. Welcome to Fox Talks. Today we're going to be talking even more about how we got to a place where the media is engulfed in a culture war. Because it's a scary place to be. Really, if you want to talk about why the news feels so fake to so many people, it's probably because it's not covering anything important. And if it's not covering anything important and yet it's still running 24 hours a day non-stop and louder than ever, what is it covering? Well, the answer is the culture war. That's good. You know, usually I don't like green tea because it's not very powerful. It's not going to give you a kick like a cup of coffee, but it's kind of weak in flavor. Use matcha powder and a bit of milk. Oh, I used a bunch of matcha powder. It tastes very green. I will say that the milk calms that down a bit, but I like it. Anyways, my last video was scripted, but I've been procrastinating writing a script. I've been procrastinating writing a script for this video for months because it's just so big and dense and really it's just so much how our media got to the point that it is. There's so many contributing factors and so many tangents and roads to go down on. So I've decided that in lieu of writing a script, I might as well just do it live.
We'll do it live. Okay. We'll do it live. Fuck it. Do it live. I'll write it and we'll do it live. Thing sucks.
The truthiness is, anyone can read the news to you. I promise to feel the news at you.
To tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God.
5, 4, 3.
So how did the media get the way it is? Why is the media this way? Why do we have a culture war that is dividing us as never we have been divided before? So at least the culture war keeps telling us. Well, I mean, if you want a TDLR here, we could just call them the corporate media and just blame it all on the profit motive. Even the aspects of this problem that aren't in corporate media, even the part that small YouTubers, independent media, we have a hand in this because of the pressures and motivations of the profit motive. So if you want an easy answer, that's it. But that doesn't really give you a solution except enact communism or socialism. And, that answer is going to work for who it works for. That answer is going to work for who it works for. But all those who it doesn't work for, you're not really convincing them. So let's actually unravel this big ball of yarn and try to figure it out. So first, I want to make clear that there's not really a perfect age of news to look back on. There is no golden age. I mean, I guess there were hints of it at different points in the 20th century at least. But mass media is a relatively new thing. And even at the turn of this century, you had giant newspaper magnates making up fake news about each other to try to screw each other's brands. So, it's never been holy or sacred. And one of the first golden ages is, comes along with people like Upton Sinclair, who I talked about in a previous video a little over a year ago. Upton Sinclair was a yellow journalist and a muckraker, and he wrote books about what was actually happening inside of factories and such as that. And that was only stunning because the media was not doing its responsible job of covering these things themselves. When the actual conditions within a factory are the defining point of the news of an era are shocking, it makes you wonder how much that era actually covered what happens inside of factories. You know what I mean? Because, rats in your food was hardly the most inhumane or cruel thing that was done in a factory in that era. So, That's just what, like, Slaughterhouse Number 5, I would say. Something like that. We also had a second period of time like this. I believe it was in Vietnam, when we actually started having journalists go overseas and just get this raw footage of what we were doing there. And it was like the first and only time that America has had to see in video this kind of unfiltered reality of what happens during war, and it instantly turned us against the idea. And that is the only war that I can say that for, even though we have been constantly at war throughout the entire century. This was the only point in time in which the news was really honest about it. And it was, you know, I maybe the government didn't, like, government propaganda about wars has gone back as far as it possibly could. I mean, the first motion pictures were bookended by these trailers about, like, how the war is going, told in these glowing and inflammatory terms. You know, like, the fucking war propaganda from World War I is ridiculous. World War II as well. I mean, this was what they showed you before movies. If you saw a motion picture at all before television, you probably also saw war propaganda. And it's not like war propaganda is not tied to our movie industry and a major funder of it now, so it's not like that even changed that much. You know, with the number of film projects that the Department of Defense fund for positive portrayals of the military or the U.S. War machine. And because we don't have similar coverage of the wars that came after, or at least not being broadcast into our homes, not anywhere other than niche media markets, really indicates that the Department of Defense and etc. really ratcheted down the control of what you could show from the war front. I mean, notice that most of the shit that we see nowadays is like these cool colored rockets flying through the air in the middle of like night vision shots in some desert. You never really see the people that get hit by these bombs. You just see a vague outline of a building in the middle of a desert. You never see the children that are blown to pieces by these weapons. You know? So, you know, obviously our media is not free to really give us the truth about the war. And, you know, we can actually see the DOD, like, directly, you know, telling the media to chill sometimes. It's, you know, we saw it in the 90s about the Gulf War. Colin Powell, you know? He got on TV to give a... to give a speech telling the military to calm down, but I mean, never mind. We're not even getting into what Colin Powell said. We'll try to find that clip though. Editor Jackie, put that clip in here instead. So when I lay out the first step, because we're not even there yet, what you have to realize is that our media ecosystem is already imperfect and does not do an excellent job of delivering us the truth on all issues. There are specific issues in which the truth is obfuscated even then. And in addition to that, you have to realize that everyone has biases, but even more than that, you know, understand the limitations of human consciousness. We can only really easily perceive and internalize a singular philosophy and perspective and worldview, and we can entertain other ideas. But really, like, the governing principles are kind of set for the way that we see the world. And the way that everyone sees the world, and the way that each of us see the world uniquely, is greatly beneficial. That diversity of viewpoints on the world helps us see each other's blind spots. I would expect no individual source to be perfectly balanced. Now, that doesn't mean that you have to be a pandering media shill or a, you know, basically a political party mouthpiece, or, you know, see yourself as some cynical warrior in some sort of digital war. You just have to try to be truthful and tell people what you see from your perspective, as best your research and the data that you can find can give you. And in that, you have to be unflinching in questioning your own beliefs and whether they are accurate, and kind of calibrating that path in your mind, that perspective. You know, that is something that must be cultivated. So that being said, there's always been bad media, right? But cable news made it worse. I don't remember what was the first 24-hour cable news station, but I do know that this is a trend that started in the late 80s. I remember around 9/11, it was headline news was a big one, and like they were kind of lazy about it, right? So here's the news model before we get into this phase I like to call news media instead of news. Like the news model before it hit cable, before it hit this 24-hour cycle, was that you would have the news on for like an hour or two in the evening on a channel that was not a news channel. This hour or two of programming would typically be kind of sparse for advertising, would typically prioritize like local advertising instead of like big brands like would... So basically it's not bringing in a lot of advertising money. They're kind of going for the cheap stuff, and they're accepting that they're going to lose some money by publishing the news, and the rest of their programming block around that is supposed to make up for that loss of profit in giving you the boring reality of the world around us. Cable news actually now has a similar model to that in a way. It doesn't look like it does, but it does, and it'll make sense when we get there. But headline news, from what I remember, they did this, they were trying to figure out how to fill the 24-hour cycle, and they were trying to be news all the time, right? And it was novel when they were the only people doing it, but the second they started getting competition from companies like CNN, which had a different model than headline news did, they really started to crumble and fail. But while they were the only news source, they could get away with doing this thing where like they have a 4-hour block, and then they'll update little bits and pieces of that block and then play it again, and play it basically 6 times a day, rotating out certain stories as new news comes in. But like if you ever watch it for more than 4 hours at a time, you'll notice that you've hit the loop and you've come back around, and maybe there'll be like 1 or 2 news stories per hour, but you're basically watching the same thing, which means that no matter what time you want to get the news, you could sit down for 4 hours and get all the news of the day. This is not the model that we use now. It was kind of a lazy copy-paste model to begin with, but it did allow them to like really kind of focus on that 4 hours of programming instead of the slack-jawed bullshit that we put together now, and pass off under this thin veneer of news. So how did CNN change the game? Why do I think that there's a significant deviation from headline news to CNN? Or I think there was like a TNN, Turner News Network at some point. Anyways, all of them compared to CNN, what, and maybe it wasn't even CNN specifically that ushered this in. I'm just picking them because they are of an era. They are of that era where there were a bunch of companies that nobody remembers anymore shifting into CNN and then expanding out to MSNBC, Fox News, etc. And all the branching news deviate, Fox Business, all of those other things. The thing that CNN did differently is that they took their channel and they called it a news channel, but they adopted the model of a regular like network television company, in that they would give you like straight news for a couple of hours during the day, but everything around that would be speculation, commentary, and basically entertainment junk food. It would be stuff that wasn't bound by the restrictions of telling you the boring tale of what is going on in the world, and would instead be more punchy and, drive engagement, all of these things, right? This is where you start working in these kind of clickbait ideas and ideologies, and this is also when, CNN is basically status quo in perspective, which does tend to mean lean a bit liberal, but more like a conservative Democrat type of base. That's CNN, right? This kind of just corporatist type news company. But then it births as it begins to just make shit up more and more often, or just kind of deviate, other companies see like, hey, maybe this is an opportunity to carve up the news market. And it's when you get MSNBC and Fox News making the, left of center and right of center. Left of center, right of center. Yeah. Left of center, right of center. I didn't know if I was mirrored or not. I'm not, actually. It flips it back. Deviations of this, and in this building of a brand, they started to build their own diverging narratives. And again, like, MSNBC is still kind of more closely grouped. Like, they're still within the Democratic Party. Like, MSNBC is the progressives, right? And these are like the dinos, really. The ones that you're like, are you sure they aren't Republicans? I don't know, they say they're Democrats. And then you have, oh yeah, they're definitely conservative Republicans over here in Fox News. It's the left side. Whatever, look. You know what I'm trying to do here, okay? And the issue is that they took the name news, CNN, cable network news, is that what that is? I don't know what the CNN stands for, to be honest with you. You've got CNN, you've got Fox News, you've got MSNBC. None of those are news. None of those words are news. Okay, but we understand that to be a news channel. But the thing is, they still have the same kind of model as these older television network channels, except instead of like playing Fear Factor at 8 o'clock, you've got Tucker Carlson. So, effectively, we've traded Joe Rogan for Tucker Carlson. And then in the age of podcasts, traded Tucker Carlson for Joe Rogan. Anyways, it's a weird story how they've flip-flopped in their time slots, right? I mean, not that Spotify really has a time slot. Anyways. So that's problem number one. Problem number one is that news channels are by volume an entertainment product that has only a broad association with the news. It is news-scented. It is misted with the essence of news, but it is a giant pile of dog shit.
Corporate media is the misinformation problem. The largest media outlets are platforming con artists, skewing the news, and immersing the country in a flood of lies. Of course, there's been a lot of discourse lately, David, about who the misinformation is coming from. And what you lay on here is a pretty compelling case that the worst offenders are the very people who protest the most about misinformation.
What are we really talking about when we talk about misinformation? And what is the selective outrage about misinformation? I think, listen, bad information is bad information, wherever it comes from, and it should not be applauded. However, let's be honest about where so much of the bad information comes from. We're a country that got lied into the Iraq War, a country that arguably, I would argue, got lied into the policies that created the financial crisis. And it was done through a corporate media system that has never apologized for that wave of misinformation and waves of misinformation that continue to come.
And what this has done over the past decades, in effect, has diluted what it means to be news. Now people are watching shows that are meant to be entertaining as opposed to factual. Sometimes downright counterfactual in their efforts to be entertaining. And they believe that this is news. And I'm not saying that Fox News doesn't put news out. I'm not saying that somewhere in all that insanity there isn't true facts and viewpoints. But like, for anybody who doesn't watch Fox News, even if there is like a needle in that haystack that is valuable and credible and important for you to know, why would you go through all the trouble of picking it out of that pile of shit?
My friend Bill O'Reilly is completely full of shit. Now, he and I agree this country does face some problems. We do have some issues. What we disagree on is the scope of these issues and the cause of these issues and the timing of these issues. I believe we have very complex problems in this country, like we have had in this country, since its inception. What is wrong with this country is not that we face problems that we have not faced before. We face a deficiency in our problem-solving mechanism. And the reason we face a difficulty in our problem-solving mechanism is that a good portion of this country has created an alternate universe in which the issues that we face revolve around a woman from Georgetown who wanted birth control, which is a health issue for women, covered on her health insurance in the same way that Viagra is covered for many others. I call this alternate reality, I call this place where these folks live Bullshit Mountain.
And the same for people who watch Fox News or right-wing media. You know, even if they recognize that every once in a while CNN and MSNBC say the right thing and are correct, even in a way that Fox News will never admit to them, why would they wade through all the bullshit to try to figure out when that moment is?
Yeah, I mean, this is the central problem, which is that how can they decry misinformation when they've been the purveyors, continue to be purveyors? And David, I mean, can you explain this to people who are more left-wing? I would say that this is always where you see the biggest pushback, but you were on our show talking about the media's treatment, for example, of like the Build Back Better plan and others. Put it more in terms that are outside of our culture war.
The censorship situation?
Or just misinformation, like
Sure.
in terms of how they portray different things and how that affects public debate.
Sure. Listen, one thing you notice is that misinformation, the drumbeat about misinformation, notice that the criticism of it is the misinformation that exists outside of the corporate media sphere. Mm-hmm. And I want to be very clear. I don't think we should condone misinformation that's outside of the major legacy and elite media institutions. As I said, misinformation is bad across the board. But I think we have to understand that the reason why people distrust corporate media is because they have a reason to distrust corporate media.
So the problem is this dilution, but also the problem is us, because these are companies that are trying to make the most money possible. And when given the choice between a fantasy and boring reality, we are way more likely to tune in to fantasy. And that's okay when it's The Daily Show. You know, we understand this is a comedian telling jokes, and that not everything that he says is going to be bound in fact. Sometimes it's just a punchline. You know what I mean? It's easy to tell with stuff like that. It wasn't very easy, apparently, to tell with Stephen Colbert and the Colbert Report. But I digress. It's different because people like Tucker Carlson do put on a veneer of newsiness. And I bring up Tucker Carlson not just because he's an easy target, but because he's actually been sued in court. I believe multiple times at this point for things that he has said during his show just being blatantly untruthful and defamatory. And his lawyers and the Fox News lawyers successfully argued in court that no one in their right mind would believe that his show is a news product, that it is obviously a product of opinion and entertainment and has no connection or basis in reality. I mean, maybe not that scathing, but they pretty much said, we are fake news. And that is how they got out of the lawsuit. So either they're being incredibly opportunistic in using this as a defense and really are trying to make news somehow, or they genuinely realize that the majority of their programming is not in any way news. It is the barest imitation of it. And even that was a little bit more productive 10 years ago. Because 10 years ago we were well into this. But then social media started to happen. YouTube started to happen. Twitter started to happen. Twitter was actually really important for the media because so many journalists are on Twitter. So many journalists break news on Twitter. You know, like, maybe your friends, but maybe not your friends, but if you're friends with a bunch of journalists, there are a lot of stories that break first, and sometimes only, on Twitter. And because of this, you know, the medium is the message. And the news like a liquid, assumed the shape of its container. And these blocks of programming that were already entertainment, opinion, speculation with little basis in reality now became tinged with clickbait. They became tinged with, one of the models that I think that emerged from internet algorithms, one of the trends that we saw outside of the news that I think has come into the news. Do you remember the era when there were a bunch of reply videos and a bunch of, not like response videos, because that's still kind of a thing, and I am still talking about that, but I mean more specifically the era where you could like reply to someone's video and it would give you a boost in the algorithm, especially if you replied to someone popular. And if you had two popular people going at it, like the Paul brothers, both channels would rise pretty much exponentially, so they could make these fake beefs that would raise the profile of both of their channels, right? Is that not exactly what MSNBC and CNN and Fox News are doing to each other right now? It's gotten so bad that I seeked out Baudrillard, simulacra and simulation, to explain this to me, because the idea of taking a thing with realness and truth and replicating it infinitely, like an Andy Warhol screen print, until it has lost all resemblance of itself, is to me the perfect metaphor for what is happening in the news media in modern times. Because there are a lot of stories that the news doesn't report, and in a way, you can gauge bias by looking at all the stories that are presently happening, by taking as many sources as possible and just watching, like where certain stories come from, right? Like who is willing to report on certain things. That can be a very good measure of bias for a lot of these. And you will see that, like, and especially if you use, I used to work for a company called News Voice. It's a great app. I'm totally plugging it here, actually. You should check it out. Maybe don't go into the comments. I haven't been on it in a couple years, but when I was there, boy, it was the first time that Facebook and Twitter started purging people. And the right was having their free speech moment, because they were, there were a lot of leftists that were being purged too, but like the bulk of it was right-wing type stuff. And they were moving to platforms like this that was talking about being, free and uncensored and stuff like that. And, I mean, at least when I was there, I was a moderator, and it was more about making sure that the blurbs related to the stories are correct. But what they would do is they would take all the different sources talking about the exact same thing, and they would attach it to a story, and then the users would write a title and a blurb. And basically the moderators, which was what I would check to make sure that those, I would read through like 4 or 5 of the articles. I'd try to get one from like every side of the spectrum so that I knew like what one was hiding from you in another. And when you start actually consuming the news this way, you notice that certain narratives are only told in certain places. And that, sometimes you can almost know like what the predictable spin is going to be on every story, depending on the source that you look at for it. Just because it's such a polarized thing, but that doesn't mean that, while they're all lying, or while they're all kind of making an illusion to get you to spend more of your time watching their content, that doesn't mean they aren't telling the truth sometimes. It's really hard to pick that out. And, but the Baudrillard connection comes from this idea that, like, the first reporting often of kind of breaking news, the one where they're basically reading primary journalism, someone who is actually doing journalism, not a reporter or a pundit or something who's just talking about things that they read. I mean, I fall into this description too most of the time. I don't often do my own primary journalism. But, when they're reporting on a news story that's just come out and they haven't had time to spin it, and they just kind of read you the headline and the blurb, you know what I mean? That is usually pretty factual. And then an entertainment block comes up after that, and they take this new breaking news, and then they just talk about it. They make their takes, right? And then in the next 30-minute block, or maybe an hour later, Fox News has, or the other side, let's say this started on CNN. Fox News has prepared a package talking shit about what was said only an hour earlier on CNN and how they got it completely wrong. And then CNN or MSNBC puts out a piece about 30 minutes after that where they talk about how this crazy Fox News anchor just went on a tirade about something super basic, which was the response there. And eventually, the facts that were being reported in the breaking news, this little segment that got like 30 minutes of airtime, the very barest facts in that might be repeated in these stories, but make no mistake, these stories are more about feuds, more about people talking shit about other people's opinions back and forth just throughout the whole media ecosystem, than it is actually delivering to you primary journalism and new information that is factual and real and you know... Instead of being reporters, these people also are trying to be influencers. And all of this, these dynamics, if you haven't picked up on it by now, come from social media. They come from YouTube. I mean, I see a lot of YouTube and especially like Twitter culture in modern media and how it's delivered now. Especially since I see a lot of mainstream media stuff through YouTube, so I get to see like their thumbnail and title first. And it's so crazy on certain, like, I also grew up, you know, one of the defining media moments, and I think that people kind of miss how defining this was for how we made the steps to where we are, the Oj Simpson trial, because that was a fucking fascination of this country for so long. When I was a little kid, and I distinctly remember many elements of that. I mean, like, I was small when this happened, and I distinctly remember elements of it just because they talked about it on TV all the damn time for what felt like at least a year. It was probably more like 6 months, but still a long time to cover a single trial, and this is something that I like to think is trial porn. So I get really tired of it, you know, just remembering that. I don't like trial porn. Like, tell me the result and tell me the relevant facts of the case, and that's all I want to know. I don't want to know the day-to-day developments and the speculation and all that bullshit and who said what about who, and, you know, is this Fox News host racist? Is this MSNBC host a shill? Who's a liberal? Who's a neoliberal? All of that stuff that the news devolves into that's not even really talking about the case anymore. And I had a lot of people share shit with me during that period of me just intentionally trying not to look for this. So it's being filtered by, like, what people I know think is important, and that shit still came back sounding like that. I learned very little about the case, even looking at those links. It was more about demonizing how someone had portrayed the case. It was more about, you know, what Fox News host needs to be canceled for what they said about a shooting. You know, like, stuff like that. And then I remembered the day that the verdict came out, and I was scrolling through YouTube on my TV, and I see the bar that's just like the corporate media bar, you know what I mean? Because they give them their own bar. I wish independent media had a bar. That would be cool. Or, like, even primary journalists. Because, you know, news is pre-digested when it comes to you on cable news, but there are actually primary journalists out there, people like The Intercept, you know, organizations like that actually publish directly onto YouTube now. There's a lot of organizations that do primary journalism, do good primary journalism, that publish directly to YouTube now. It'd be good to have them get a bar, because they tend to be, because they are less commentary and more boots on the ground journalism. They tend to be more factually correct and accurate and informative than most of your cable news sources. But anyways, I see this, I see, like, it was like the AP or something. It was like results in Kyle Rittenhouse case, and then you see MSNBC. No, it was Fox News next. Fox News was liberals outraged that Kyle Rittenhouse is acquitted, and then you see MSNBC next to that, and it's like 60% of Republican voters think that Kyle Rittenhouse or no, it was something like Fox News is why is Fox News trying to make Kyle Rittenhouse into a folk hero or something? And it's just like, look, I just want to know how the fucking case ended and why it ended that way. None of these articles are likely to tell me that except for the first one. Like, an AP is one of those sources of primary journalism. It doesn't mean that they're, completely immune to bias, but if you want good journalism, go more directly to the source. And in fact, if you could, pay those people, because they don't make nearly as much in advertising. They don't make nearly as much being bribed by corporations to tell stories in a particular way, like a lot of these big mainstream sources do. And a lot of these primary journalism sources are dying because of this. And, if they die out, then all we have is speculation. No one's going to know anything. And you definitely aren't going to have local news, because that is, these big nationwide conglomerates, they could give a fuck less what happens in your town. And, they also realize that 99.999% of their voters don't live where you are, of their viewers don't live where you are, so why should they even care what's happening in your town? You're only going to get that primary journalism from your local newspaper, and even if you don't read it, maybe subscribe online. Probably don't get the paper delivered, because, that's wasteful if you're not going to read it. But I do encourage you to read it. And to subscribe to it, just to subscribe to my channel as well while you're at it. You don't have to give me any money like them, but the subscription helps me as well. So, really, I think that one of the biggest problems, and Jon Stewart himself very well made this point, and I'm glad that I waited to make this video until now so that I can include this. But Jon Stewart, who has an excellent news show if you're not pirating it, because fuck Apple TV, just saying, find some other way to watch it. There's clips of it that are actually really good up on YouTube. I don't actually pirate it. To be honest, I like the clips that I see on YouTube though. I'm satisfied with that, and I really don't want Apple TV. But
over the course of the last week, as this discussion about media misinformation has happened, there have been some things that have happened that haven't been talked about, but really embody the problem. Let me give you one example. NBC News just announced that it is hiring for across all of its platforms a guy named Stephen Hayes. He is a conservative pundit, and he is most famous for, or infamous for, publishing a book that platformed the biggest, most salient lie leading America into the Iraq War. He published an entire book about the alleged connection between Saddam Hussein and Al-Qaeda, a connection that didn't exist, that was thoroughly debunked, but that was used to push America into the worst foreign policy disaster in modern history. And so he did that and is now being rewarded during a time of heightened fears about potentially a war with Russia and the like. He is being platformed, rewarded for that, with a huge platform on one of the largest news networks in the country.
Where I run into trouble is the thing you just said. You talked about they want the benefit, but they don't want the accountability. And you mentioned weapons of mass destruction. And it reminded me, like, the New York Times, right, was a giant purveyor of misinformation and disinformation. I don't know that the Times was purposeful, but misinformation. And that's as vaunted a media organization as you can find, but there was no accountability for them. And I think where I get nervous is in the run-up to the Iraq War and in the prosecution of the Iraq War, I was very vocal and sometimes cursed about that. But the mainstream view, the New York Times, was they have weapons of mass destruction. They have these tubes that can only be used for nuclear war. Saddam Hussein is this, he's that. Couldn't I have gone down and fallen down this if Viacom or Comedy Central had wanted to censor me or had wanted to take me off the pot? Look, I'm not owed a platform. Nobody is. So it's not a First Amendment issue. It's not any of that. We're really, once you're in bed with a corporation, the deal is they have to sell enough beer and you get to do what you want. Right. But my point is, these are shifting sands. And I think I get concerned with, well, who gets to decide what that, I mean, in the Iraq War, I was on the side of what you would think on the mainstream is misinformation. I was promoting what they would call misinformation. But it turned out to be right years later, and the establishment media was wrong. And not only were they wrong, in some respects, you could make the case that they enabled a war that killed hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people and never paid a price for it and never had accountability. And just having an ombudsman print a retraction, to me, is an accountability.
Yeah.
I'm more worried about the algorithm of misinformation than the purveyor of misinformation. Misinformation
Absolutely.
will always be out there, but if the algorithm drives people further and further down the rabbit hole, the fucking algorithm is the amplifier and the catalyst of extremism. And if you can, I would much rather fuck with the algorithm than deplatform and all these other things.
He makes a really good point that a lot of these issues, I think that there would still be a lot of issues with the media because, I laid out a lot of issues before we even got to the internet. But a lot of the issues that we see in current media and a lot of the fuel of the fire of the culture war comes from algorithms and the ways that algorithms, especially like the Facebook algorithm, is designed to infuriate and divide us.
Our story isn't going to be about the fun side of the internet tonight. It's going to be about the rampant misinformation on it. It's something that we've covered multiple times before, from Alex Jones to vaccine misinformation to conspiracy theories. But tonight, we're going to be looking specifically at misinformation that spreads among immigrant diaspora communities. Basically, instead of stuff like this Facebook post in English titled "The Fake Vaccination of Kamala Harris," which incidentally Facebook has flagged as false information, we're going to be looking at stuff like this post in Spanish featuring the exact same video, which as of taping has no such warning. And that actually isn't that surprising when you consider that according to the recent Facebook Files expose, while more than 90% of Facebook's monthly users are outside the US and Canada, when it comes to the hours the company spends on monitoring misinformation, last year only 13% was spent on content from outside the US.
And then how the YouTube algorithm is meant to drive you into rabbit holes to where, you start by watching Fox News maybe, and then you've got Ben Shapiro being suggested to you, then you've got Sargon of Akkad, and all of a sudden you're watching a David Duke video, and you're like, who? I know that name from somewhere. This guy seems a little racist. No, this guy seems really racist. Wow. How did I get here? You know what I mean? So, really, what this says to me, and what I think is going to be kind of a theme for me moving forward, something that I will think about in the way I cover a lot of stories moving forward, is algorithms are incredibly powerful. And algorithms could be used to do amazing things that are just impossible with man hours and labor. Like moderating any of these platforms. I would prefer a light touch. Even though it's not a violation of the First Amendment, I do think that censorship needs to have a light touch on these platforms, because if it doesn't, you may cheer for some of the channels to get banned, but what you won't see is so many little leftist projects or people that are trying to tell you what's actually going on with like the military-industrial complex or things like that are also going to be de-emphasized or removed as well. So, don't cheer for that. But there are certainly, like I talked about with OnlyFans, there are certainly very illegal and very damaging to the people who are involved things that are happening on some of these platforms, and we need moderation for them. And while ultimately there needs to be a human at the end of the line who is acting competently, which is something that we don't see with YouTube, and we don't see with MindGeek, and we don't see with OnlyFans, and has basically been a part of the problem of almost all of the companies that I've gotten into lately. You really do need that algorithm to show, but I am also a big believer in being able to flag things as well, like being able to use, kind of crowdsource it and use the users to figure out what is bad. But ultimately there needs to be a person at the end of the line that is receiving these auto-flagged and manually flagged things and determining if they are just illegal. And if it's not illegal, if it I don't know, like the laws that regulate the internet in this way are kind of ridiculous. And like we're seeing the government even more and more lately try to petition to remove specific people from platforms. And that seems like some backdoor issues with the First Amendment. Like, if the government isn't supposed to censor us, then the government shouldn't use a relationship with a business to censor us either. That also seems kind of fishy. So, again, in summary, the profit motive. Because, learning how to game these algorithms and making the type of stuff that you want to see, making the news equivalent of super processed, unhealthy junk food, when, really they should be trying to feed you your vegetables. And, as a people, it would definitely help if we got a little bit more willing to eat our vegetables, if we started supporting the people who try to honestly bring us the news, and supporting primary journalism, supporting your local paper, please through electronic means, but, do it. Support these people, because without them, all we have is pundits. And we're kind of starting to see what a pundit-led America looks like.
Let me give you another example from CNN. I mean, CNN, you've seen a lot of their officials go out in the last week praising their former, now disgraced, deposed president, Jeff Zucker. A lot of them praising him as some great hero. Right. Jeff Zucker oversaw the lionization of Governor Andrew Cuomo while Cuomo was covering up a nursing home massacre in New York, while Cuomo was shielding his nursing home donors from legal consequences for that. There was one report in Rolling Stone that one source alleged that Zucker was personally involved in those segments between Andrew Cuomo and his brother Chris Cuomo to sort of create that positive valorization of Andrew Cuomo. So again, my point is, what are we actually talking about when we talk about misinformation?
It's not nice. And it reminds me of something, and this is gonna be our last point, and then I'm gonna end the video. This reminds me of something like the disinformation program that Putin put in power after taking control of Russia. So Putin was a member of the KGB, which is just another intelligence agency, kind of the Russia's mirror of the CIA. And as that, he had a lot of training in manipulation of large groups of people, in media manipulation and kind of, I don't want to say cyber warfare, but this sort of, what's it called? Social engineering and kind of mass media manipulation. And what he did was he kind of absorbed a lot of the news agencies, and he created basically two camps. And, one of these camps would be kind of a more overtly state-run organization. And they would tell you the truth about half of the time and lie to you with state propaganda the other half. They would tell you just enough of the truth that they would remain credible, even though they kind of position themselves obviously to seem like a state source. And then they would also create the antithesis to that, the critical source. And that critical source, the controlled opposition, they could also feed a bunch of bad information in. So, you know, when you can verify that the person who's telling you that this other company is kind of a puppet of the state, and you can verify that they're lying about other things, but it does really seem like they're a puppet of the state, but you can also verify that they're lying about things for the state. So, like, are they true? But they also lie. And you just come to this place where you're so overwhelmed with trying to figure out what the truth is that you just stop. You know that the media is going to lie to you and you can't trust either one. And I think we're kind of there, honestly. I'm not entirely confident that we can put the genie back in the bottle. But I don't think that we're doomed either. I think that we need to be aware that this is happening, and I think that we need to support alternatives, and not just alternative media, because of course, and this is an important caveat, and something that I think about with a lot of the news sources that I consume being corporate media critical, is that anyone who is critical of whatever a mainstream position is, you know, they can be doing that in their own self-interest. You know, any conspiracist, the first thing that they would attempt to convince you of is that the whole mainstream narrative is a lie, because, you know, unshackling you from this position where you feel like you know what truth is very beneficial for supplanting in your mind your current belief system with a belief system of the propagandist's choosing. And that is a danger with everyone, and for that reason you should always be very well aware of what the perspectives of the person who is speaking to you are, so that you can always take them with a grain of salt and say, well, I see why they would say that. And you know what? That perspective makes sense or doesn't to me. You know, you need to be able to critically evaluate all of your independent sources. But at this point, like, I can't tell you that that all the independent sources are lying to you. There's certainly some that are not great. There's definitely a lot that are not great. It can be a little bit of a minefield, just like the media is, but there are people out there who are honestly trying to do the right thing. And, you know, also, and if you're looking at mainstream media sources, if you're looking for good mainstream media sources, there are at least 3 that I can think of, that, like, really big ones that I would really push. They all have one thing in common. They're all supported by the public. You could say that they were state-run, and BBC, yeah, kinda. But they're more state-funded, which also means that they're kind of like they're a non-profit. You know, they get all of their funding from that, and they don't have to advertise, and they don't have to worry about upsetting advertisers in the way that they tell their stories. They're not looking for, as I mentioned in my 1,000 subscriber video, you know, they're not looking for Lockheed Martin to sponsor their Why We Should Go to War in Ukraine articles or anything like that. So companies, news organizations like NPR, BBC, and Al Jazeera, oddly enough, even though, you know, if you look at Qatar, it's a very conservative country, and I might, if I remember this, I'll put a link in the description that talks about the kind of unusual case of how Al Jazeera comes to be such a reputable news source, despite the fact that it is it's very, like, progressive oriented in a lot of ways, and it is in, like, one of the most conservative countries in the world. So it's a really odd mix, but it works for them, and it's interesting to see how that is. But I am not the most eloquent speaker on that topic, and I will let the most eloquent speaker on that topic have at it in the comments, or have at it in my description. And if you think you have any eloquent thoughts on any of this, you can have at it in the comments. But like and subscribe, do all that good stuff if you really want to support the channel. And again, I encourage you. I think, you know, I'm going to keep making this content as long as I feel up to it. But the people who might not keep making this making content that you really need to be informed are your local newspapers. So I encourage you to find out what your local newspaper is and get an electronic subscription if you can afford it. And if you have any extra money after that and you want to say thanks, you can send me a one-time donation on Ko-fi, or you can subscribe on Patreon, which has its own benefits. I do some extra content over there. Sometimes you get to see content earlier, even have a voice in how content ends up getting presented. Not in the way of like the way that campaigns get presented in different ways depending on how much money people give them, but just like stylistic choices, which topics I cover. But ultimately, I retain the right to do pretty much whatever I want. But it's, sometimes I'm kind of like indecisive. I want to post like a list of things. It's like, hey, what do you guys want to hear about? So it's not like, give me $20 and I'll do a video about why we should go to war in Ukraine. Thanks, Lockheed Martin. And it's not like that at all. But it is a community that I'm trying to build up, even if it's not just to get donations, but to have kind of like, know who my dedicated fans are, know who's really watching the videos and enjoying them, and kind of be able to, because I've always got like 10 fucking ideas in my head at any given time. It's really annoying. And sometimes it just helps me if you help me pick one. So maybe I'll find a way to like allow my patrons to vote on that kind of stuff. That would be pretty cool. Maybe like you get to pick, the patrons get to pick like one a month or something. I don't know. It could be fun. But this video has gone on too long already, and it's probably getting devalued in the algorithm because of it. But if you stuck around, I appreciate it, and be sure to tune in next time.
That's tomorrow, and that is it for us today. I'm Bill O'Reilly. Thanks again for watching. We'll leave you with Sting and a cut off his new album. Take it away.